Thank you very much, Moges, for having this talk with me today. Your name is Moges Teshome. You studied international criminal justice, human rights and international studies in Ethiopia, the UK and in Vienna. Recently you have been affiliated with the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna, but also with the VCDNP, which is also based in Vienna, dealing more with non-proliferation. And you also regularly contribute to journals dealing mostly with the conflict in Ethiopia. Today I would like to discuss with you a little bit the situation in Ethiopia around the big question if peace is possible in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a big country. It's, by population, it's the second biggest country in Africa. It has around 110 million of inhabitants. And it has a different past than many of the others because it never went through this colonialization, this long colonialization process. But nevertheless, it's also very multi-ethnic. I think there's more than 80 different ethnicities, some of them even with multinational identities. What happened in November 20, I think, there was a conflict uprising, especially between in the northern part of the country against the government. The so-called Tigray people in the north were fighting against the government. Maybe you can give us some overview about what were the root causes, what happened there, why did this conflict evolve, what is going on within Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here and talk to you and brief you on what is really going on in Ethiopia. And as you rightly put, the conflict broke out last year in November 2020 and it's still going on, even though there is some kind of temporary halt, what we may call a de facto ceasefire, even if none of the parties has announced it yet. So the country has gone through so many turning points in recent histories, and the current crisis, or maybe you can say both military and political crisis, is the outcome of structural causes. And one of the structural causes being, it pertains to the state formation itself. Because as you have tried to mention at the introductory part, that the Ethiopian state formation was not affected by external factors, including colonization, but it is very much defined by its own internal dynamics, including various interest groups, most particularly the identity politics now. So the Tigray Liberation Front, or the TPLF, has been in power at least for the last 27 years and ruling that particular region, the Tigray region, since the 1970s.
Which is mostly in the north, right?
Mostly in the north, and it is far north, which is in the neighboring Eritrea, actually. So those groups were ousted in 2018, the so-called reform, which we also, including the international community, welcomed, that the dawn of democracy and rule of law would be reigning in Ethiopia. But unfortunately, those TPLF leaders and some other disgruntled group were dissatisfied with the power arrangement and with the new administration, including the prime minister. And the structural cause is that both ideologically and in terms of the kind of states they wish to form, the multi-ethnic federal state, versus the so-called unitary state, which they perceive this prime minister is heading towards, has led to these two different political parties and the groups to come to a confrontation among other issues. So the constitutional issues, the state formation issues, and the role of identity politics in shaping the Ethiopian politics all contributed towards the structural causes of the conflict. And now what we have is actually just simply the manifestation of those structural causes. We can discuss about the details of the nature of the conflict and what's really going on now. Yeah.
You remember the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. He entered office in 2018, and he was also granted the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, mostly because of he managed to get into terms, let's call it like that, with Eritrea, which was like for a stalemate. It was not really a hot war, but it was also not peace and a peace agreement there. So he was granted this Nobel Peace Prize, and suddenly, I mean, I would say shortly afterwards, there erupts this big conflict within the country. Abiy Ahmed was perceived as trying to unify the country. So what happened with this policy? Or why did it not work out? What happened to this dialogue project, which he was trying to initiate?
I think that's actually a very good question to pose at this moment, because the Prime Minister, as an individual, as a leader, as a visionary leader, was perceived by most people domestically and internationally as the unifier. And to that end, he came up with the so-called, he called it the political philosophy of synergy, or he published a book called Maddamer in Amharic, which means synergy. But the problem is that it has never been properly understood, either by the Prime Minister himself, what he meant by synergy and unity, neither by the other political parties and political active stakeholders. So one of the problems is lack of clear roadmap, I would say. So that is the main sticking point. Then, as the Prime Minister tries to implement his policies, then he came across, of course, formidable roadblocks, because his co-opting mechanism, or creating inclusive political system, has actually went from bad to worse, in the sense that he rather prioritized consolidating his own power at the expense of bringing the country together. Mm-hmm. And regarding the transitional justice mechanism, which you just mentioned, it was highly touted and appreciated by the international community, saying that now is the time where we have to do justice and then do truths, find out truths, and forgive and forget the past, and move on and chart a better future for the country, political future. Nevertheless, the Nobel Peace was taken as a shield to commit so many crimes, or at least some blunders at domestic front. And even the Nobel Peace Prize, which was good, but it was premature. So many different actors and international community has dubbed it as a premature awarding. Actually, in the Nobel Peace Committee, one of the paragraphs says that we are giving him that, hoping he will do his homework in the future. There is no such kind of Nobel Peace Prize in the past. I don't know if that is a possibility, but then they did. They gambled on that, and he proved to them that they were wrong. But the peace with Eritrea, or I could say the retreat or rapprochement, was a good initiative, but it lacked any institutional basis. It was the relationship between two presidents, and actually where they were trying to siege the TPLF, as it happened to be the case later on. So that was some of the problems with his peace initiative and his so-called synergy and unity. Yeah.
So we've been hearing since the outbreak of the war about the very bad humanitarian situation, especially in the northern region. There are many refugees that have been there before as well, especially from Eritrea, but also many people fled the Tigray region to South Sudan, for example. The United Nations also was speaking about an effective blockade of humanitarian aid. Do you know by chance, how is the humanitarian situation now, especially in the north of the country?
The humanitarian crisis, it is a catastrophe, to say the least, because their ordinary peoples are suffering not in thousands, not in hundreds, but in millions. Now, generally within the country, more than 20 million people needs a life-saving assistance, mm-hmm. which is huge, not adding all other crises which is going on in the country. So there is some form of humanitarian blockade, because the access to the northern region was very difficult, mm-hmm. but it is not only because of the government. Yes, from the government part, there were some kind of vetting procedure where the relationship between the UN and even international community was somehow embroiled. However, the TPLF was using also the blockade as a means of political mobilization, so that the people will rise up and take arms. So it is from both ways. But regardless of whom to blame, there are so many people who are suffering, even facing starvation, and throughout the northern part of the country, not only in Tigray, because as you may remember, since June 2021, the conflict had expanded all the way to the Amhara and Afar region, both located in the immediate neighbor to the Tigrayan region. So these three regions, the Afar, Amhara, and the Tigray are now in the dire humanitarian need for assistance, and I think the UN is now doing a very marvelous job by airlifting some aid to the area, and there is some bilateral agreement between the government and the UN system to provide some assistance. But the humanitarian catastrophe defies any human imagination. Yes.
You've been mentioning that the conflict also spread, so it's not only between North Tigrayan and then the government, like more located to Addis Ababa. I mean, there was in November, there was this rumor, or at least let's say that they have become very close, also the Tigrayan, the TPLF, the Tigrayan Liberation, People's Liberation Front, close to Addis Ababa. But you also mentioned the Omoro region, so there is more difficulties within Ethiopia. It's not only, I would say, fighting between two parties, but it's more, right? Maybe you can express a little bit more, like, what is it about? Is it like an ethnic conflict? Is it religious? Is it about power and autonomy? I mean, what would you say to this?
I think that is also one of the pertinent issues to be considered. And when we talk about the war in Ethiopia, generally, and on the northern now, it used to be northern within the Tigray, now it is northern. And it was spread to the neighboring region by the TPLF because the TPLF wanted to settle score, in a sense, to revenge against the Amhara ethnic group. And the Afar, because that is their military strategy to blockade, to cut off the federal government from the main supply line, which is the Djibouti. Mm-hmm. So Afar is located on the main highway from Djibouti. So they invaded the Afar region for that specific reason, and the Amhara region because they think that the Amhara used to be the one who actually orchestrated the war itself, ethnically speaking, mm-hmm. both politically and ethnically. Yes, the conflict has ethnic nature in itself. Even the very reform was around the two major ethnic groups, Amhara and Oromo, with the so-called Oromara alliance. And that alliance was perceived actually by the TPLF as if it is only a victorious justice. So those two ethnic groups have pushed away the TPLF, including, of course, the Tigrayan people. And the Tigrayan people are an ethnic group which has been there fighting against the government in the past, as you know, successively throughout the three different regions. And now when we talk about the war since, at least since June, it has become a public war, in a sense that they wanted to make it an ethnic war, an all-out ethnic war. So thank God that there was no all-out ethnic war, but still there were so many ethnic elements in the war where there are so many informal militia groups from the Amhara and other regions have also participated in the war to fend off the further expansion of the TPLF all the way to the central part of the country. Of course, you are right, the TPLF advanced to the central highlands of Ethiopia, which is only 150 kilometers at times from the capital. But there is one force which we tend to forget. The Oromo Liberation Army in the south has never been factored into this, because the TPLF established some forms of formal alliance, military alliance with the Oromo Liberation Army, which is fighting on the western part of the country. And of course, the constituency of the Prime Minister himself. He considers himself as representing the Oromo. But the Oromo people, through the Oromo Liberation Army, has been fighting and is still fighting. So that was the military strategy. The TPLF from the north and the OLA, in abbreviation, Oromo Liberation Army, from the west and the south, so that they wanted to sandwich the government of the Abiy. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it wasn't successful. So yeah, that's the dynamics.
How do you see, if we look a little bit at the bigger picture, I mean, the African Union is also there, it's based in Addis even. How do you see the role of international actors in this conflict? They have been advocating for dialogue, it was the African Union, but also neighboring states. What about the European Union, the United Nations? Like, how do you see their efforts? What role can they play? And can they be still be supportive of Ethiopia and the government in this context?
But yeah, the role of the international actors generally has been a kind of, I would say, it's mixed. It's mixed. At times it is also a disparate group and at the same time desperate group. There are some desperate group which want us to end the conflict itself without having a proper strategy. And then these groups are desperate in a sense that they are different, they have their own agenda and different interests. So if we take it not as a country but as an institution, as you mentioned, the African Union, the UN and the European Union, these three actors, I think among the three of them, it's only the European Union which has been consistent in its policy. So that is something that we need to appreciate. They have put their normative power as they used to be. Of course, there are some limitations where they pushed for humanitarian access and putting the life of the people on the table and above and beyond everything, and trying to provide, of course, humanitarian assistance even during those challenging and trying period, and then also diplomatically speaking, trying to isolate the government from the rest of the world. So when it comes to the European Union, I know it is not enough, but it was consistent with its policy. But with regard to the UN and the African Union, it was a mixed result. For one thing, there are confusions at the beginning because the hope was still there. The hangover of the peace, Nobel Peace, and the so-called reform was still in their mind. Even to this day, the hope is still there, thinking that the Prime Minister and his party are going to move this country forward and bring the much awaited for democratization. So that is part of the confusion. Then the United States wanted to do it alone, to go it alone, in which case there is no alignment between the UN and the United States policy. So the United States policy was a bit unilateral in that regard. And when it comes to the African Union, finally, which is supposed to be the institution which is there in the capital, and of course African by nature, and has also, by the way, security structure in its constitutive act. The AU Constitutive Act has, including even the deployment of special forces when necessary and conflict management. But they haven't done much other than two incidents. The first one, they tried to release some forms of press and calling up on parties, and then they wanted to investigate the crime being committed, especially international human rights violations through the African Peoples and Human Rights Commission. That is the two things they did. But finally, it was commendable that they appointed the representative, former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, which has been trying to bring the parties together, and to some extent it was successful. That is why the parties now has started talking to each other, and there is even a possibility or a rumor that there will be a formal negotiation which will be started soon because of the effort, not necessarily of the African Union, but the final effective strategy between African Union, the UN, and of course the European Union. So that was the final strategy, and I think that will bring some change, hopefully.
Do you think that also, especially those international actors, that they were also afraid what the conflict would mean also for the whole of the Horn of Africa? Or do you see like they have feared more or less that there would be a spillover effect to, I don't know, Somalia or Eritrea or even to Sudan? I mean, what would you say to the effects on the region in general?
I think the international community has had a legitimate concern when it comes to the peace and the stability of the Horn of Africa, the Greater Horn, as they call it, because of two reasons. One, the region is already devastated by continuous conflicts and stateless states and a lack of effective and strong government. If you see all the Ethiopian neighbors, Ethiopia used to be the net security exporter. Mm-hmm. Because South Sudan is in trouble. Even the main Sudan has got its own domestic problem. Somalia is as you know it. Eritrea on the north. It's only Kenya somehow which is relatively stable within those countries around neighboring Ethiopia. Among the 6 countries, only Kenya which has some peace and stability. So adding the country which has more than 117, by estimate now, million people, and to see some forms of state failure and destabilization on top of that, and keep in mind that the conflict has ethnic aspect in nature. So if the state fails to contain the conflict and the ethnic war breakouts, you would imagine what happened in history here in Eastern Europe. So that would be what the international community has been thinking about. But the second aspect, especially for the European Union, is the issue of humanitarian crisis and refugee influx. Because 110 people, if 10% comes to Europe, it means like 70 million. So 10% of 117 is 70 million. 70 million is huge. Mm-hmm. So they have a legitimate concern from both security aspects or security broadly defined as human security and regional security. Yeah, you are right.
I read that now the Council of Ministers decided that probably the state of emergency within Ethiopia, which was they planned it for around 6 months, but they want to reduce it to 3 months. So they advocated for ending it, the state of emergency. Would this give Abiy Ahmed probably the possibility to engage again in a dialogue on national unity? What about reconciliation, transitional justice? How do you see the prospects in these fields?
The prospect for bringing about justice, peace, and the unity, as you put, is I think that is too much to expect. There is some hope, and I would start from the lifting the state of emergency is commendable and a good initiative in the right direction, because there are so many innocent individuals, journalists, and political prisoners because of that state of emergency, which was unnecessary. So they were right in doing that. But in terms of its effect, the peace negotiation and negotiated settlement between, at least a ceasefire between the warring parties, is the immediate concern for everyone, because people are suffering. They have to stop it at any cost. And then the other issue will come next. But these grand issues of bringing about national dialogue, reconciliation, national consensus, and somehow rebuilding the state is, I would say, it is very far-fetched, and we have to be realistic. And if anything, what the Prime Minister and his party is doing in regard to the national, whatever they call it, dialogue and reconciliation are already failed, because they established the National Reconciliation Commission 2 years ago, and it has expired without doing a single thing. Mm-hmm. So now we have the national dialogue on top of that. Again, a commission, which is handpicked by the federal government itself, and it's going to fail from the very beginning. So what is the effect? The effect would be somehow still trying to give legitimacy to the government of the Prime Minister of Abiy. That is the maximum we could do, unless some kind of inclusive procedure is followed, and all parties, including the warring parties, are invited to participate in the national dialogue, which the ruling party is saying, no, we are not going to talk to the terrorists, and we are not going to negotiate. Then with whom are they going to have a dialogue? Because the very purpose of having a dialogue is to resolve the underlying causes of the conflict. And the conflict is between the TPLF and the federal government and other armies, as I told you. So it is flawed from the very beginning, but the least I would expect is the cessation of hostilities, and to give some space for the people somehow to rethink and engage with each other. Yeah.
If you could give an advice to the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, what would it be?
That would be a very tough question. But still, if I have to give him one advice, I would say, put the interest of the state before your own personal aspirations, dreams, imaginations, and nightmares. So he's doing the other way. If he can do that and try to sacrifice his short-term political goals, like so many visionary leaders did, like Mandela and the President of Colombia and the Prime Minister of Israel, which was assassinated because of making peace, trying to make peace. Those are the kind of leaders which history remembers forever. So that's my advice. Put the interest of the nation and the state before his own immediate personal and political and power-mongering. That would be my advice.
Thank you very much, Mose, for your time, and it was very interesting for me to listen to your analysis, and let's hope for a bright future for Ethiopia in the years to come. Thank you very much.
I remain hopeful. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure.